So chaps, how about your setups? How did you manage to install a full 7.1.4 rig into your mix rooms? Did you follow the quote unquote rules, or did you seek advice, or did you follow your audio noses?
My house is a mid-century modern house. So it was built in 1952. It's got a sloped ceiling. This particular room, I think, must have been added on many years ago by somebody else. It's strangely built in that the walls are not parallel, which is fantastic. And the ceiling is not only sloped, but it's kind of like moving from, it's sloping from left to right. In other words, it's a little lower in the left than it is in the right, and then it's sloping upward. So there's a document, I believe they call it the DART. It's the Dolby DART. It's like a spreadsheet. You put the speaker and, you put your measurements. I took one look at that thing and I was like, yeah, I'm not doing that. I can't, because this room is just too funky to even figure out. So I called my friend Brendan Duffy, who was getting into Atmos around the same time. He was moving a little faster than I was, and he's gone on to do some stuff for Bruce Dickinson and some hip hop people, and he's done quite well. And I called him in a panic because I had already drilled multiple holes in the ceiling, and they're still there. But Brendan gave me a great idea. He talked me off the ledge. He goes, all right, look, put a mic stand at the listening position and take some twine and stretch it to start with your left, center, and right. He says, you have those in place? I said, yeah. And he goes, okay, from the tweeter to the listening position, make sure that the twine is equal distance from all the speakers to all the tweeters. And when he said that, I was like, oh, of course. That helped me place the speakers. Now, one of the kids walked in and there's a mic stand with all this twine coming off of it going in all directions. It looks like I'm in the middle of some mathematical exploration. And one of the kids was like, is there something going on here, Dad? Is there something you want to tell me? I was like, no. It's cool. I'm measuring distances. And I try to explain myself. And they had this look on their face like my dad's crazy, because literally you walk in and there's just like twine emanating from this mic stand to all these speakers, and they're trying to figure out what the hell I'm up to. But point is, once I did that, it was stupidly simple of where to put the speakers. And so what that does is it minimizes the amount of delay compensation you have to do, time alignment of speakers, because they're all already equidistant from the listening position, the sweet spot. So that's a consideration in your placement if you're struggling with that, like I struggled with it.
I guess this has to go back to the COVID discussion. We were fast and furious mixing Atmos at Capitol for Universal, and lockdown happened. It was COVID. And we didn't know what was going on, blah, blah, blah. But we lost access to the building because, it was lockdown. We couldn't get in the building. We were all employed. They were paying us. So we had work we needed to do work. I had a little studio at my house. It was a little, we call the Nook, a little office area. Just a stereo setup. I could do small projects here, editing, stuff like that. But it was enough of a studio to make it worthwhile. I had enough projects outside of Capitol that it was a worthwhile thing. So when lockdown happened, the last day of lockdown, we didn't know what was going to happen. I grabbed as much stuff as I could from the studio. I loaded up my car. I had a bunch of speakers, different sets of speakers that I had laying around, old stuff, whatever. And very quickly we realized, okay, we're not going to get back into that building. It's going to be a few months, probably, or a couple months at least. But I had all these projects lined up and they wanted stuff to be finished. So within a week of the COVID lockdown, again, it was kind of my wife's idea. She was like, look, you got to work. And if you don't work, we don't eat. So why don't you take the living room? Because you can have more space and you can put an Atmos system in, right? And I went, yeah, I can cobble something together. And I had the support of Universal and Music and Capitol and Dolby. I had been working with all these people. So very quickly, I had all the software I needed. Within a week, I had cobbled together kind of a guerrilla ghetto Atmos system. I had JBLs in the fronts and PMCs in the back, and I didn't have height speakers, and I stole the subwoofer off my television system, like a little subwoofer. But I was able to do stuff. I could work. I could keep working. The one thing I didn't have was, again, it was my living room. It wasn't tuned. It was, me with pink noise and an iPhone trying to calibrate stuff. But at the time I had already mixed, a few hundred songs. So I was pretty familiar with the system. So I could play stuff back and go, okay, this is what it's doing. I get it. Songs I had already mixed. But the one thing I told them, I said, look, I'm going to keep mixing, but I'm not delivering anything for release until I can hear this in a real room. Because I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm in a living room with mismatched speakers and all this. And after a while, it got to a point where I had access to a room and I could get in and listen to stuff and tweak mixes, and it worked out really well. And then when we started going back to work, we still had lots of work, but I had this Atmos system in my living room. And it was like, well, we have 2 rooms at Capitol. Well, if the other guys can work there and I can still work at home, let's just do that. So the record company, the studio was fine with that. They were like, hey, look, work at home. So I would work at home for like 4 days, and then I would go in one day and check all my mixes in a real room and deliver stuff. And it worked out great. I didn't have to drive in. It was an extra room for them. Everybody was happy. Then we found out that Capitol was going to be closing for earthquake renovations. And then we found, so during the process of the studio closing, well, I still had this room I could mix in, which was great because I could still work and I could still mix songs for the record label. And then we found out that we were all going to be laid off for, extended period of time, probably permanently. And it was, okay, I'm now an independent guy. So, but I still had all kinds of work, Atmos work to do. And I also, I mix some video games and films. So it's not just Atmos work I do, surround stuff. So it became, well, this is now my home studio. So we kind of upgraded a little bit. I permanently mounted the ceiling speakers. I got a full, proper PMC system. I had it calibrated by Dolby. I installed some doors and stuff like that. And now I pretty much work out of here. It's great. I love it. Believe it or not, this is one of the better sounding mix rooms I've been in. I've got it pretty dialed in, actually. So my neighbors think I'm nuts, and the mailman is probably wondering why I listen to Christmas music all summer.
So with regard to Dolby Atmos in particular, what is speaker calibration, and most importantly, how is it done?
With an Atmos build, it's really important to individually calibrate every single speaker in your room. With a stereo system, this is not so much of an issue, and there's a really good conversation happening between, do I need to calibrate my stereo speakers or not? There's a really good arguments on either side. With Atmos, you need to calibrate because you have 11 speakers that all need to be telling you the same thing. And you don't just get that with good placement or getting used to it. You have to calibrate. So your Symphony has all the calibration built in. You will need to figure out how to build calibration profiles. In other words, you're going to need to measure every speaker in your room, and you're going to need to correct the frequency response. You're going to need to correct the time alignment, and you're going to need to correct the level of every speaker. Yes, the Cali speakers have settings within them that if you put them up against a wall, we have DSP that we know what walls do when you're within a proximity of a wall of our speaker, and we can take the wall out. When you're calibrating a system for Atmos, you're going to be measuring the speaker as it is out of the box and applying a correction on top of that. So even though we could probably get you closer with those dip switch settings, I think it's cleaner and easier to know the speaker isn't doing anything. We're going to put all the calibration in one place. The question then becomes, how do you land at what EQ to apply? And there's a lot of answers out there for this. So with our newest speakers, with the SM series, we are actually offering, we have a series of videos that you can go to that will show you how to measure your system. And you can send us those measurements and we can send you back calibration files for your system. We're offering that with the SM series. Previously, what we've offered for people who are setting up an Atmos rig with Cali is that we will come to your room, we will take those measurements, and we will give you the parameters for you to program. We're probably going to move away from that, but I think for your system, what would be a good idea if you want to go with this is you go through our defined measurement process, and we can still send you back, here's calibration files for you to load into your Symphony.
I think in building and setting up a mix room, that room calibration is kind of the most important thing. And it's not so much the tonality of the room, it's the timing. You got to get your speaker delays set up and dialed in, because, it's an object-based system. It's not channel-based. So, as you move stuff around the room, it kind of doesn't matter where your speakers are. And honestly, I think I've seen one room, and I believe that the guys at Dolby told me that they've seen one room, which is probably the same room, where all the speakers are actually equidistant from the listening position. And so pretty much no room has that, because there's always a fireplace or a window or a door or, a walkway. So, as much as like I tried to get my speakers equidistant, the back speakers are farther back than the front speakers. The side speakers are closer. So getting the delays right is really important. And I used the Dadman software for that. And then, I'm lucky I had Dolby come and tune my room. So my room got a professional tuning, which is great. So I have some EQ points and stuff like that in my room. But you don't have to go that extreme. I also, before Dolby did it, I was beta testing the SonarWorks system, and that worked really well, especially for the delays. Setting up the delay. It takes a minute to learn how to do it, but so that kind of, I think the room calibration and the room setup is the most important part.
So how many computers am I going to need for this thing? I understand that early systems had 2 or even 3 computers, and the routing was, well, at best, messy.
Yeah, so we had a playback system, which was just our playback Pro Tools system. That fed what did we call it?
Was it the RMU? Was that the phrase? The Dolby Renderer?
Well, that was last in the chain.
Right, okay.
So we went at Capitol, we went from, and both our rooms had it, from the playback system into I guess we called it the print rig. Mm-hmm. So which was another Pro Tools system, 128 channel Pro Tools system. So one system was MADI from one Pro Tools into the second Pro Tools. Mm-hmm. And then that fed Dante into a PC RMU. It was a theatrical RMU at the time, because that's the only one they had.
Yeah.
And then that fed what we called the B chain, which is the actual speaker system, the monitoring system, mm-hmm. which at Capitol was very elaborate, because we were also, it was a stereo mix room. Mm. So we had to be able to literally switch from Dolby Atmos back to an analog console and bypass all of the room tuning and all that kind of stuff. So it was quite complicated. And you would come in, like there were mornings where I would come in and like I couldn't get sound to come out of the speakers. And it was so complicated. I didn't, it took years to actually figure it out, mm-hmm. kind of. Because I wasn't a tech person. I'm still not a tech person. So it has become much more simple. My whole room is running off of an M1 Mac Mini.
The early Intel machines from Apple, I don't think they were just barely powerful enough. When I started my system, I started it on a 2017 MacBook Pro running Pro Tools and the Dolby Renderer on the same machine.
Mm-hmm.
And while it worked, there was a jet engine kind of sound that I could associate with that MacBook Pro. Since then, I've graduated to a MacBook Pro M2 14-inch with 96 gigs of RAM, and it's way more than capable to do the job. I don't hear it ever spin up fan-wise. So yeah, you are correct. In those early days, it was traditional, it was typical to have the renderer on a separate machine, Pro Tools on another machine, and a lot of connectivity. My budget and my tolerance for overly complicated setups caused me to just say, no, I think I'm going to do it this way. And having a few people in the beginning kind of scratch their heads and go, I don't know if that'll work. No, actually, you're right. That will work.
So I'm not going to give the game away. All I'm going to say to anyone watching this is go over to Working Class Audio, over to the website. Your course is free as well, which is amazing.
Yeah, it is free. Just give your email address to me, and I promise not to bombard you with too many emails, except for announcing Working Class Audio episodes. And then, just walk through the course. I think it's pretty straight ahead. I've had a lot of people watch it, and it seems to help out a lot of people. I hope I didn't confuse anybody.
So digging into the mixing minutiae a little bit, can you tell me what the bed is and what objects are in an Atmos workflow?
The bed, I think, is basically the holdover from the film world. And I could be speaking out of turn here too, so we both could be corrected. But my understanding is the bed, when you're mixing for film, typically most everything is put into the bed, and each channel of the bed is essentially one of the speakers. And the bed typically is, I think, size-wise is 712. So it's all the speakers except two of the ceiling speakers. It treats, I believe, the four speakers up top like two sets of stereo speakers, left and right. I believe. So I never started mixing in the bed ever. Through my initial lessons, we'll say, with Steve Genowick, Steve and everybody I knew who was a disciple of Steve's, a mentee of Atmos from Steve's, all were mixing taking objects, which typically in the film world, the objects were meant to move things around. If there's a helicopter flying over, for example, in a film. In music, however, most people early on that I met were using the objects to create an object bed. In other words, a recreation of the bed that would accommodate for the four top speakers. This isn't everybody, but most people I learned from in those early days were doing that. So I adopted that method. Some would say that the translation was better to consumer Atmos systems using an object bed. I don't have any evidence to back that up. I'm just going on what I was initially taught. So some people do it slightly different. I think, and I'm spacing on his name, and I apologize. His first name is Brad. I think his last name is Lee. He's the person who has worked with Billy Joel for many years, and he's recently done a lot of the Billy Joel catalog in Atmos. And I'll just tell you, like, flat out, it sounds amazing. I grew up listening to those records, and he did it right. He really did the Atmos right in this. I did see him in New York do a presentation on his mixes, and I have read articles, and I'm to understand that the way Brad does it is he mixes in the bed, and he only uses objects for the 4 top speakers. So I'm just going to say that whatever you got to do, whatever method you use to make your mixes, do you. As long as it sounds good, I don't really think it matters. So I hope I haven't lost you there. I mean, it's a lot to wrap your head around, excuse the pun, but it really, it's not as complicated as you think or as it sounds. Once you see it, if you're a visual learner at all, it makes complete sense. And you make your decision about whether or not you might say, I'm going to mix in the bed and use objects sparingly, or I'm going to mix all in objects and do that. It's whatever works for you. As long as it sounds good, I don't think anybody cares. Here we are now in a new frontier with Atmos. And I think that many people recognize hey, let's not exploit this and do stupid things. Let's be musical. Let's do smart stuff where it makes sense in the Queen thing and maybe some early Pink Floyd things. I get that, but the average modern pop, rock, hip hop, whatever you're working on now, for what I would say is, today's music. I think there's an opportunity here to do make some musical decisions and place things in tastefully done ways.
So Atmos is great when you have an Atmos system to hear what we've been creating. But what about stereo or binaural mixes for headphones?
Rightly so, right or wrong, most people are going to hear this on some kind of consumer headphone system. As we sit here today, it's AirPods, it's coming out of an iPhone, so you do have, where when I started mixing in Atmos, it was, there's a headphone thing and there's these settings in but don't worry about that. Nobody's going to listen in the headphones. It's a totally different thing. And then, 3 years later, it was, oh shit, we have to do headphone mixes. We actually had to go back and apply binaural settings to mixes that we just never thought about. So now, I do spend time in the headphones because that's where people are going to hear it. I don't necessarily I won't change a whole lot based on the headphones, and it depends on the album I'm doing. If it's a frontline pop record that's going to be listened to in the next year, I'll probably spend more time than if it's a, audiophile kind of catalog project that I think is going to be consumed more on a speaker system. Mm-hmm. For the more pop centric stuff, I'll spend more time in the headphones probably. But you have to have it. You have to pay attention. Those binaural algorithms are constantly changing, especially with Apple, even though, they're Apple and they don't tell us anything. You can be pretty confident that those binaural algorithms are changing probably every time you do a software update on your phone. And they're getting better, which is great. But yeah, headphones are a thing, and they never were before. It's way more fun listening in speakers. It's a better representation of what you're doing. But the headphones are a real thing, and you have to pay attention to it for sure.
Which is the primary? Do you mix in Atmos and then it deals with the fold down to stereo, or do you mix in stereo and think, oh, I can throw this a bit further in that direction or that direction? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's really very similar to the old days of, hey, I'm mixing in stereo, let's check the mono compatibility. Although this places the emphasis in more equal fashion to both. So
right.
On my controller, on my Grace, I can switch between the Atmos mix and the stereo mix without any delay. I can just click, What does it sound like in stereo? What does it sound like in Atmos? And usually the process is somebody sends me the tracks. I open up my Atmos template. I bring those tracks in. I essentially push everything to the left and the right. and get a rough mix going in stereo. And then I switch over to Atmos and start moving things around and refining that mix. And at some point, once I have the Atmos mix in good shape, I'll listen. And I'll tell you, honestly, the number one thing that I always make adjustments for are vocal level. What I'll do is I'll have that Atmos mix. I'll think, okay, this sounds good. What does it sound like in stereo? Okay, it's good. Vocal's a little loud. Let's tuck the vocal back a little bit and see how that affects the Atmos. And every time I do that, it's like, oh, okay, that actually sounds better in Atmos. So once I get across that point, feeling good about the stereo, feeling good about the Atmos in the speakers, then it's time to put the headphones on and listen to the binaural aspect and listen to how the metadata, and I'll define what that is. Listen how the metadata is affecting the mix in headphones. The metadata meaning the perception of, there's different settings. There's off, where basically everything is like right here. There's near, mid, and then far. And that applies to all of the speakers or all of the channels that you're dealing with, whether you're mixing in the Dolby's bed or using objects or an object bed. We'll get into that minutia momentarily, but essentially it's creating a different space in the headphones. And my goal is to make the stereo that I hear in headphones and the binaural as close as I can, so that there's not such a disparity between the two. So there is parity between the two, so that should the listener happen to turn off Atmos on their phone as they're listening on their AirPods, they don't listen and go, wow, that's drastically different. What's going on? I try to make that as close as I can now. But it starts with the speakers for me.
So you've created this amazing immersive mix. What file does that output as? How do you transfer that to someone else? And how can someone else enjoy the Dolby Atmos mix you've created?
Out of the renderer, and nowadays the renderer comes as part of Pro Tools, part of Nuendo, part of Logic. It's a built-in, what we call the internal renderer, or you can use an external renderer. You kind of have to have a license for both, I believe. But actually, maybe not. I guess for the external renderer, you have to have a license. Either way, your mix is going through that renderer. When I'm done with a mix, I bounce what we call an ADM file, which is basically a multi-channel wave file. So it's my Dolby bed, which is a 7.1.2 bed, and then however many objects I've used, up to 128, of which the first 11 are the bed. And those appear as separate audio channels. So when you bounce a file, you bounce what we call an ADM file. And then that file can be read by a Dolby Atmos renderer. It cannot be played back, in any other format. You have to have a renderer to play that back.
Right.
If you want to, listen on headphones or play it back on a soundbar, something like that, you have to create an MP4 version of that, which you can do in the renderer.
Right.
But what we actually deliver is an ADM file.